The house smelled of roasted turkey cinnamon and nutmeg, the scents that usually meant comfort and celebration. But on that Thanksgiving night, those same smells carried a strange heaviness clinging to the walls of my childhood home in Columbus, Ohio. I was 29 years old, standing in the dining room where I had once braided napkins for my grandmother's hands and scribbled homework in the corner while my mother set pies on the counter. Tonight, the table was dressed perfectly, white linen candles flickering cranberry sauce shining like jewels, and yet I felt like a guest at my own family's gathering. My father, Richard Carter, sat at the head of the table, silver hair slicked back the patriarch he loved to imagine himself to be. My mother, Linda, hovered nearby, her pearls gleaming, ready to hush or smile, depending on what would keep appearances. And my brother David, the golden son, tapped his wineglass to call for attention, already basking in the pride my father reserved only for him. I took my seat at the far end, almost by the kitchen door. The conversation rolled easily for everyone else. David bragged about his new promotion at the bank, and Richard's booming laugh filled the room. Every sentence about my brother was met with praise. Every time I tried to speak about my job as a project manager in a small firm, my words were sliced short, trampled by jokes or dismissive nods. "Daughters marry out," my father muttered under his breath, almost like a mantra he had repeated my whole life. The words were meant to sound casual, but they lodged in my chest like stones. I kept quiet, cutting my turkey in tiny pieces, trying to remember why I had come home at all. Maybe it was guilt, maybe the hope that somehow this year would be different. But as the meal went on, the familiar storm began to gather. My father poured his third glass of bourbon, the laughter too loud, the veins on his temples pulsing. When the conversation turned to inheritance, the air froze. My father cleared his throat. "David will take over the house and the accounts," he announced, voice heavy with certainty. "It is tradition. Sons carry the name. Daughters. Well, Emily, you will be fine on your own." His words scraped across me. My fork clattered against the plate. I tried to stay calm, but my heart pounded so loud it drowned the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I spoke for once louder than usual. "That money is not only David's. Grandma's trust was meant for both of us. You know it. I have the papers." The room went silent. The candle flames seemed to shrink. David's smirk widened as if my defiance was nothing more than a childish tantrum. My father's hand gripped the edge of the table knuckles, turning white. "What did you just say?" Richard's voice dropped low, dangerous like a rumble before a storm. "I said I have proof. You forged my signature. You stole what was meant for me." My hands trembled, but I forced my gaze to meet his. The room exploded. Richard shoved his chair back with such force it toppled. The sound of wood cracking against tile made my stomach lurch. He rounded the table in 2 strides, and before I could stand, his hand struck my face. The slap burned hot, the taste of blood filling my mouth. But he didn't stop. His fist came next, heavy and merciless, crashing into my ribs. The room blurred with gasps and shouts, but no one moved to stop him. Not my mother, not my brother. The only sound that cut through was my mother's trembling voice. "Family first, Emily. Don't ruin Thanksgiving." Her words hit harder than his fists. The world tilted. My chair tipped. My body slammed against the floor. Pain radiated through my chest, sharp, blinding. I heard someone yelling for 911, but the edges of my vision were already going dark. My last memory of that night in the house I once called home was the sight of my brother raising his glass again, smirking, as though this violence was only another show he was entitled to watch. When I woke, the air smelled different. Sterile, cold, humming with machines. White walls, fluorescent lights. The hospital. My ribs ached with every breath, my head pounded, and my arm was wrapped tight with gauze. A nurse leaned over me, her eyes full of pity. "You were lucky. Another blow, and you might not be here." Behind her stood my mother, clutching her purse like a shield. Her voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "We will not involve the police. This is family business, family first." Tears stung my eyes, not from pain, but from betrayal so complete it hollowed me out. My father had beaten me into a hospital bed, and my mother chose silence to keep the facade of family intact. At that moment, as the heart monitor beeped steady beside me, I knew something inside me had shifted forever. I was done being the silent daughter. The hours after I woke in that hospital bed blurred into one another a haze of morphine and muffled voices. I lay still, afraid that any movement would set off the knife-like pain in my ribs. Each inhale felt jagged, like my lungs were scraping against broken glass. The machines beside me beeped cold reminders that I was alive but far from safe. The doctor came in around dawn, a young man with tired eyes who looked like he had seen too many versions of me. Patients battered by those who were supposed to protect them. He asked the question softly but firmly. "Do you want us to notify the police?" "This is an assault case." His words hung in the air, heavy like a lifeline dangling just out of reach. Before I could open my mouth, my mother's voice sliced through. "No police. We'll handle this as a family matter." She gripped her purse tighter, her pearl bracelet clinking like a chain. Her eyes never met mine. Instead, she stared at the floor as though if she avoided my gaze, she could avoid her own guilt. The doctor frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, it's the patient's decision." My mother finally looked at me, then her eyes sharp and commanding. "Emily, you know what your father is like. We don't need outsiders. Family first, always." Something inside me cracked. I wanted to scream, to tell the doctor, "Yes, please, call the police. Lock him up, free me." But the words jammed in my throat, strangled by years of being told to keep quiet, to keep the family's face clean. My lips barely moved, but I whispered, "Not now." The doctor looked at me, long disappointment clouding his eyes, then left with a quiet nod. The room fell silent. Only the heart monitor spoke its steady rhythm, exposing my cowardice, or maybe my conditioning. My mother sat down, smoothing her skirt. "This will all pass, Emily. Don't provoke him again. You should know better by now." I turned my face to the wall, tears sliding hot and silent. She thought this was about provoking him, as though my very existence as his daughter was a provocation. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, anything to keep from sobbing in front of her. When she finally left, the air felt lighter, though the weight inside my chest grew heavier. Alone, I pulled my phone from the bedside drawer. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it, but soon muscle memory took over. I opened a hidden folder, one I had built over years. Screenshots of bank statements, scans of letters, photographs of documents, voice memos I had secretly recorded. Each file was a shard of the truth pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of theft and betrayal. There was the insurance policy in my name with a forged signature. The trust fund my grandmother had set up for both me and David, but somehow every withdrawal had been funneled into accounts tied only to my father and brother. The student loan documents that proved I had been saddled with debt while David's tuition was mysteriously covered. I scrolled through each one, the evidence glowing in the dim hospital light like embers of rage. For years, I had convinced myself that gathering this evidence was pointless, that I would never have the courage to use it. But lying there bruised and broken, I felt a new heat rising in my chest. It wasn't just pain. It was anger, steady searing, refusing to be ignored. I opened the Notes app and typed Thanksgiving. Richard assaulted me. Witnesses Linda David. Injuries documented at ER. I saved it, adding it to the pile. My breathing grew slower, my heartbeat steadier. They thought they had silenced me with fists and with words. But the truth was already written down, time-stamped waiting. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. I did not need the doctor's report or the bruises blooming purple along my ribs to remind me that my father's violence had always been part of my life. It was not always fists. Sometimes it was the quieter blows, the ones that left no marks but carved deep scars anyway. When I was 6 years old, I remember coming home from school with a drawing of our family. I had drawn my mother, my father, my brother David, and me holding hands. Richard looked at it, smirked, and said, "That's wrong, Emily." David stands next to me. "You stand by your mother. Sons carry the family line. Daughters just tag along." I was too young to understand, but the sting of those words stayed. My drawing was tossed in the trash, and David was lifted into my father's lap like he was already a king in waiting. As we grew older, the favoritism hardened into law in our house. David got new baseball gloves, new cleats, summer camps. I got hand-me-downs and silence. When David turned 16, he was gifted a shiny blue Ford. When I turned 16, my father told me, "You don't need a car. You'll have a husband to drive you someday." My mother nodded along as if this was wisdom. I still remember standing in the driveway watching David rev the engine while I clutched my backpack, knowing I would be walking to my part-time job at the diner. College was worse. David's tuition was paid in full. I saw the receipts once a check written straight from my grandmother's trust. For me, there were no checks, only FAFSA forms and debt collectors. I worked 3 jobs waiting tables tutoring shelving books in the library, just to cover what financial aid would not. I studied at night, exhausted, my fingers raw from scrubbing dishes, while David sent me photos of him at fraternity parties. When I asked my parents why his education was covered and mine was not, my father's response was sharp and final. "Because he is the future of this family. You are not." That was the wound I never healed from. Not the unpaid bills, not the sleepless nights, but the constant reminder that my worth was measured against my brother and always found lacking. My mother's silence hurt just as much. She stood by every time pearls around her neck smile frozen, repeating the same phrase whenever I dared to push back family first. But what she meant was Richard first, David second, and you, Emily, last. The imbalance stretched into every corner of life. When my grandfather died, I was left a letter handwritten in his shaky script telling me he loved me and wanted me to have something to build my future. He had set aside a portion of his life insurance for me, but that money never arrived. I found out later through a bank slip accidentally left on the kitchen counter that the payout had gone directly into my father's account. David's name was listed as a secondary beneficiary. Mine was absent. I carried these slights in silence, stacking them like bricks inside myself. I told myself it was just the way things were, that maybe my family was old-fashioned, that maybe someday I would be accepted for who I was. But each holiday, each dinner, each comparison to David added more weight. My father's words echoed, "Sons inherit, daughters obey." Even small victories of mine were twisted. When I bought my first used car with my own savings, my father sneered, "Who's going to fix it when it breaks? You think you can handle that? You should have saved that money for a wedding dress." When I was promoted at work to project manager, David laughed in my face. "So you manage paperwork. Big deal. Dad says real success is measured in assets, not job titles." Through it all, only one voice tried to soothe the sting, my grandmother Margaret. She whispered in my ear during Christmas Eve, "Don't let them convince you that you are less. I see you, Emily. You're the strong one." Her words were the only balm, but even she could not shield me from the storm that brewed each time my father poured another drink and sharpened his bitterness into words or fists. By the time Thanksgiving came and the violence finally broke my body into the hospital bed, I knew this had been years in the making. It was not a single night of rage. It was a lifetime of disregard, the inevitable explosion of a house built on favoritism, greed, and silence. The bruises would fade, but the numbers never did. Numbers told a story no one in my family wanted spoken aloud. They were cold, undeniable, and every time I stared at the spreadsheet I kept hidden in my laptop, I felt both rage and clarity building in equal measure. It started with my grandmother's trust fund. She had told me once when I was 15 that she had set aside money for both me and David. "So you'll each have a chance to start life on steady ground," she whispered, slipping a folded paper with the account information into my hand. The figure was $160,000 each. At that age, it felt like an impossible fortune, a gift of love and hope. But by the time I turned 18, the account tied to my name was nearly empty. David's remained full, and soon after checks were written for his tuition. My father's signature appeared on withdrawal slips that should have required mine. Then there was my grandfather's life insurance, $250,000. The policy listed me and David equally as beneficiaries. I never saw a cent. Months after the funeral, I found a document shoved in the bottom drawer of the study, and my name was there, but the distribution had been altered. Someone had forged my signature, waiving my share. I stared at the shaky scrawl letters that looked nothing like mine yet stood in court-worthy ink as if I had willingly given it away. The theft wasn't limited to inheritance. My parents had a habit of using my identity whenever it suited them. At 21, when I was already drowning in student debt, I discovered a credit card in my name with over $14,000 in charges. Airline tickets, home renovations, even David's new set of golf clubs all billed to me. When I confronted my mother, she waved her hand as though it were a silly misunderstanding. "We needed it at the time, Emily. You'll pay it off when you're older and making more money. It's family." But I was the only one paying. Year after year, I logged everything $14,000 in fraudulent credit card debt, $80,000 drained from my trust, $125,000 stolen from life insurance, $30,000 in student loans that should have been covered by the fund. The tally grew, the columns in my spreadsheet stacking until the total was almost $500,000. $500,000 siphoned away, funneled to David, hidden under the excuse of tradition, cloaked in the phrase family first. I still remember the sickest moment of all. The year I bought my used Honda Civic proud that I had managed it with my own savings, I got a notice in the mail my wages were being garnished for unpaid taxes. Apparently, I had cashed out a retirement account worth $22,000 the year before. Except I hadn't. My name was on the form, my social security number scrawled across it, but the signature was a crude imitation. It was my father's handwriting disguised poorly, like he didn't even bother to make the lie convincing. And why would he? He never thought I'd dare to fight him. Every time I sat in silence at those family dinners watching David talk about his latest investments or my father boast about his legacy, I had to bite my tongue. My phone in my pocket held the truth. Scanned documents, bank statements, photographs of forged checks. I kept them safe, not because I believed justice was coming, but because documenting it gave me something to hold on to. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that I wasn't just the difficult daughter they painted me to be. I added the Thanksgiving assault to that ledger. ER admission, November 28, 2024. Injuries documented: fractured rib contusions on the jaw and arm. Witnesses: Linda Carter and David Carter. My mother had begged for silence, but the medical file existed, and in my private folder, the story of their theft was already written. As I lay awake in the hospital nights, later scrolling through the files, the numbers glowed at me like an indictment. $471,263. That was the real tally of what they had taken, not just money, but my education, my future, my stability. Every dollar stolen was another bruise on my spirit, another reminder that I had been raised not as a daughter, but as collateral. And the irony was cruel. They thought they could bury me under silence, that fists and forged papers would erase me. But what they never realized was that silence had made me meticulous. Every wound, every theft, every betrayal, I had written it all down. One day, I promised myself those numbers would speak louder than their lies. 3 days after I was discharged from the hospital, I drove slowly to my grandmother Margaret's small house on the edge of town. Every turn of the wheel made my ribs ache, but I needed to see her. Unlike everyone else, Grandma had never turned her eyes away when I was hurt. She was 84, her hair silver and thin, her body frail, but her gaze still burned sharp as glass. When she opened the door, her expression crumpled. "Emily," she whispered, pulling me carefully into her arms. Even with her light touch, pain shot through my side, but for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something close to safety. She eased me inside, settled me on her floral couch, and fussed with a blanket, though the heat was already on. She didn't ask how it happened. She already knew. Word traveled fast in families like ours, even if truth was twisted in the telling. She poured tea into china cups, the same set she had used every Christmas since I was a child. "Your mother called," she said finally. "She said you slipped, that you fell against the table." Her eyes narrowed. "But I've seen those bruises before on my daughter and now on you. That man hasn't changed." Tears pressed hot against my eyes, but I blinked them back. "He nearly killed me, Grandma." And Mom stood there saying, "Family first." Her jaw tightened. She reached down beside her chair and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was heavy stuffed and sealed with brittle tape. She laid it in my lap like a gift and a weapon all at once. "I've been holding on to these for years, waiting for the day you would need them." My hands shook as I peeled back the flap. Inside were documents older than me. Trust fund papers, insurance policies, original copies with signatures that hadn't been tampered with. And then, tucked neatly among them, were duplicates, the versions my father and brother had submitted, signatures changed, beneficiaries altered. Even to my untrained eye, the forgery screamed from the page. Letters slanted where mine never had loops stiff and unnatural. I flipped through them, heart-pounding. There were bank slips from when I was still in high school showing withdrawals from accounts I hadn't even known existed. There were photocopies of checks made out to David from funds meant to be shared, and at the bottom, the most damning piece of all my grandfather's original will, leaving equal shares to both grandchildren compared side by side with the altered version where my name had been erased entirely. Grandma leaned close, her voice low but fierce. "I warned your mother years ago. I told her this would destroy the family, but she chose silence. She chose him. I won't watch them do to you what they did to me. Your grandfather trusted me to keep copies, and I have." My breath caught. For so long, I had kept my own secret folder, doubting whether it was enough, fearing I was overreacting. But here was validation in Elder's hand, placing proof in mine. "Why now?" I asked, my voice small. "Because you nearly died, child," she said bluntly. "Because they will never stop until you stop them, and because you are not alone anymore." Her words settled in me like fire. The anger that had been simmering since Thanksgiving sharpened into something steadier, something I could almost name resolve. For the first time, I could see a path forward. I tucked the envelope back together, holding it against my chest. "Grandma, if I use this, if I fight them, everything will change." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Then let it change. Better the truth tear open the lie than you keep bleeding for their comfort." In that quiet living room surrounded by the smell of lavender and old wood, I realized she was right. My family had built their power on stolen ink and silence. But with this folder, silence was no longer my prison. It was my weapon. 2 days after my meeting with Grandma, I found myself sitting in a polished office downtown, the kind of place where the carpet muffled every footstep and the framed diplomas gleamed behind glass. The sign on the door read, "Harvey Green, Attorney at Law." He was in his late 50s, gray hair swept neatly back, glasses perched low on his nose. He shook my hand firmly, studying the bruises still fading along my jawline. "Emily," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "Your grandmother called me. She said you have something I need to see." I slid the manila envelope across the desk, my palms slick with sweat. Harvey untied the string, spread the papers out, and began to read in silence. His brows knit as he compared signatures, flipping between originals and altered versions. He scribbled notes on a yellow pad, his pen scratching fast. When he finally spoke, his tone was sharper. "This isn't sloppy paperwork. This is deliberate forgery." He pointed to the trust fund document. "See, here, your authentic signature is rounded the loop in your Y consistent. But on this version, the Y hooks upward. That's a textbook sign of forgery." He pulled another sheet forward. "The life insurance policy is worse. Look at the beneficiary list. Your name has been crossed off in a different ink, then initialed with something that looks like yours. I've handled fraud cases for 30 years, and this is one of the most blatant I've seen." I swallowed hard. My chest ached, not from broken ribs this time, but from the confirmation of what I had feared. "So I'm not imagining it." Harvey's eyes met mine steady. "No, you're not. And with this evidence, you have a case. A strong one." He tapped his intercom. "Susan, can you come in here?" Moments later, a woman entered, tall, sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She carried a laptop and a leather-bound notebook. "This is Susan Miller," Harvey introduced. "Forensic accountant. She'll help trace the financial trail." Susan greeted me with a firm nod and began laying out spreadsheets. She had already pulled bank records tied to my family name. "I've cross-referenced the withdrawals from the trust with tuition payments made to Ohio State University for your brother. Every dollar that should have been yours went straight into his education. We're talking about $80,000 here." She scrolled further, showing highlighted cells. "Here's the $250,000 life insurance payout, deposited into an account under your father's name 2 weeks after your grandfather's death. There's no record of any distribution to you." Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up another chart. "And this is the credit card debt, $14,000 charged to your Social Security number. Purchases include airline tickets, golf clubs, home improvements, none of which match your spending patterns." I felt my stomach churn. To see the theft laid out so clinically, line by line, stripped of excuses, was both devastating and liberating. Harvey leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Emily, what your father and brother have done is criminal. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. If we take this to court, they face prison time. The word prison echoed in my mind. For so long, I had believed justice was out of reach. But here, it was spoken aloud in a lawyer's office backed by numbers and evidence. But Harvey continued, "You need to understand this will tear open everything. Your mother, your brother, your father. Once we move forward, there's no going back." I looked down at my bruised hands resting on the table. I thought of Thanksgiving night, of the sound of my father's fist against my ribs, of my mother whispering family first, as if that erased the violence. I thought of David's smirk as I collapsed to the floor. My voice came out steady, surprising even me. Then let it tear. They already tore me apart. Susan closed her laptop, meeting my eyes. "We'll prepare a timeline. Every dollar, every signature. Numbers don't lie. When the time comes, you'll have more than a story. You'll have proof that even a court can't ignore." Harvey nodded. "The next step is confrontation. They won't admit guilt privately. We'll need witnesses. Make it public enough that they can't bury it. Are you ready for that?" I felt a pulse of fear, but underneath it something stronger, anger sharpened into resolve. "Yes. I've been silent my whole life. It's time they hear me." Harvey gathered the papers back into the envelope, his expression grim but approving. "Then we'll set the stage." 2 days later, I sat across from Harvey and Susan again. The envelope of documents lay open between us like a crime scene. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, and through the tall windows the December light slanted cold and gray. Harvey tapped his pen against the yellow pad, his voice deliberate. "Emily, what we're looking at isn't just family squabbling. These are felonies. Let's name them for what they are." He pointed to the altered trust fund documents. "Forgery signatures falsified to strip you of your rightful share, punishable by years in prison." He slid the life insurance policy toward me. "Fraud, intentional misrepresentation to divert funds. That's a federal matter. The amount exceeds the threshold for felony insurance fraud. We're talking 20 years potentially." Susan leaned forward, flipping through her spreadsheets. "Identity theft. They used your social security number to open accounts, rack up debt, and file false tax forms. That's not just unethical, Emily. That's criminal identity theft punishable by both state and federal law." Hearing the words out loud sent a shiver through me. Forgery, fraud, identity theft. They sounded like headlines from a newspaper, not labels for the people who raised me. My chest tightened, but beneath the fear was a spark of vindication. Finally, someone outside of me named the crimes for what they were. Harvey continued, his tone measured but firm. "We could pursue this in court immediately, but litigation is lengthy and public. Your father will fight, your mother will lie, and your brother will posture. The question is, what outcome do you want?" I hesitated. "I want them to admit what they've done. I want restitution, and I want it witnessed, not whispered in back rooms, not covered up with family first. I want people to see them for what they are." Harvey nodded slowly. "Then we build pressure, a confrontation in front of family and trusted witnesses. Enough eyes on the table that denial becomes impossible. We can prepare restitution papers, legal agreements, forcing them to repay what was stolen. If they refuse, we file criminal charges. Either way, they lose." Susan slid a folder toward me. Inside were neat summaries of every theft, every forgery. Color-coded charts broke down the timeline: 2009 trust withdrawals, 2014 credit card opened fraudulently, 2017 insurance payout diverted, 2021 tax fraud. At the bottom of the last page, in bold, total $411,263. My hands trembled as I traced the numbers. This is my life, my future, all stolen because I wasn't born a son. Susan's eyes softened. "And now it's documented. Numbers don't carry bias, Emily. They tell the story you've been forced to live." Harvey leaned forward, folding his hands. "The risks are clear. Your father is volatile. He may lash out again. But legally, once we present this in front of witnesses, we hold the power. The choice will be his sign and repay or face prosecution." I thought of Thanksgiving night, of collapsing onto the floor as my mother whispered family first. I thought of David smirking while I gasped for breath. The anger that surged in me now felt cleaner, sharper. I've been his daughter, his scapegoat, his punching bag. No more. If the truth destroys the family, then let it burn. Harvey gave a grim smile. "Then we set the stage at Christmas dinner. They won't expect you to return so soon after the hospital. That's exactly why it will work. We'll bring the documents, the restitution forms, and a couple of neutral witnesses. Your grandmother will be there. They won't be able to hide." Susan closed her laptop with a decisive snap. "It's time they face what they've done, Emily. And it's time the daughter they dismissed becomes the woman who holds them accountable." For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift. The evidence was no longer just a folder in my drawer. It was a weapon, and I was no longer afraid to use it. The days leading up to Christmas felt strangely calm, like the silence before a storm. My ribs still ached when I breathed too deeply, but the bruises had faded to a sickly yellow, and I could move without flinching. Grandma called me every night, reminding me to eat, reminding me to stay strong. Harvey finalized the restitution papers, thick with legal jargon and signatures awaiting theirs. Susan organized the spreadsheets, charts, and timelines so neat and irrefutable that denial would be laughable. On Christmas Eve, I stood in front of my mirror, buttoning a dark green dress that Grandma had once worn in her younger years. My reflection didn't look like the daughter they used to dismiss. My hair was pulled back, my posture straighter than I remembered. For the first time, I looked ready. The plan was simple but sharp. I would attend Christmas dinner at my parents' house carrying not gifts but the envelope of truth. Harvey and Susan would not be there. Their presence would have made it a courtroom before the time was right. Instead, Grandma would bring two trusted friends from churchwomen in their 70s who had known my family for decades. Their role was not to interfere but to witness. When the moment came when my father tried to sneer or my mother tried to shush, there would be no hiding. The drive to my childhood home was long and tense. Snow fell in heavy flakes, blanketing the streets in silence. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, the folder of documents strapped into the passenger seat like a fragile passenger. Every turn of the tires crunched against ice, but my mind was louder flashes of my father's fist, my mother's cold voice, David's smirk, and then, like a counterbalance, flashes of Grandma's words. "Better the truth tear open the lie than you keep bleeding for their comfort." When I pulled into the driveway, the house glowed with twinkling lights, wreaths hung carefully on the windows. From the outside, it looked like the perfect holiday postcard. Inside, I knew sat the rot. The front door creaked open before I even knocked. David stood there, a grin tugging at his lips. "Well, look who decided to show up," he drawled. "I thought you'd be too busy nursing your little hospital vacation." My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. I stepped past him, the folder clutched to my chest. The living room was full of relatives, cousins laughing, the tree glittering with ornaments collected through decades. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Emily," she said, her tone careful, polite. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Her eyes flickered down to the bruise still faint on my jaw, then quickly away. My father sat at the head of the table, just like Thanksgiving. His presence filled the room heavy and suffocating. He didn't stand. He didn't greet me. He simply watched as if daring me to speak. Grandma arrived moments later, shuffling in with her cane, her two friends from church at her side. Their coats were dusted with snow, their eyes alert, curious. They greeted everyone warmly, but when their gaze met mine, I felt the silent understanding we were here for more than dinner. The table was set again in perfection, roasted ham, mashed potatoes, pies lined neatly in the kitchen. My mother bustled, trying to maintain the facade. Laughter rose from the cousins, but beneath it I could feel the tension coiling tighter, waiting for the match to strike. I took my seat not at the far end this time, but midway down close enough to look my father in the eye. The envelope sat in my lap, heavy with every injustice. My heart hammered, but my hands were steady. Tonight, the silence would end. As plates clattered and glasses filled, I barely tasted the food. My mind ticked through Harvey's instructions: wait until the meal has begun, let them feel comfortable, then present the documents clearly, calmly, without hesitation. Witnesses will keep them from twisting the story. Restitution papers must be signed tonight. I glanced at Grandma. She gave me a small nod, subtle but strong. The time was coming. The first half hour of dinner was an elaborate performance. Silverware clinked, relatives laughed too loudly, my mother darted in and out with fresh trays of food, her smile stretched thin. My father carved the ham with a steady hand, as if the man who had sent me to the ER a few weeks earlier had been erased from memory. My brother David leaned back in his chair, sipping wine like a prince surveying his court. I waited every bite of food heavy in my throat, every minute ticking closer to the moment I would end the silence. My palms pressed against the manila folder in my lap. The weight of it was unbearable and liberating at the same time. Grandma sat across from me, her friends Martha and Ruth flanking her, their quiet presence anchoring me. When dessert plates were being cleared, I pushed my chair back slowly. The scrape of wood against tile cut through the conversation. All eyes turned to me. I rose the envelope clutched in my hand. My voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word. "I came tonight not to celebrate," I said, my gaze fixed on my father. "I came for the truth." A hush fell over the table. My father set down his fork, his eyes narrowing. "Emily," he said, his tone dripping warning, "don't start." I placed the envelope on the table and untied the string. Papers slid out in neat stacks, spreading across the polished wood like cards in a high-stakes game. Originals beside forgeries, bank slips beside withdrawals charts highlighting the trail of theft. I pushed one stack toward David, one toward my mother, and finally one directly in front of my father. "These are the documents you forged, the money you stole, the lies you buried under family first." My voice no longer shook. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Emily, please." "Don't I cut her off? You knew, you watched, you let him do it." David chuckled low and mocking. "You really brought homework to Christmas dinner. What are you going to do, sue us?" Grandma's cane thudded against the floor. "David Carter, you keep your mouth shut!" She snapped, her voice surprisingly sharp for her frail frame. "I gave you love, not a license to steal." My father shoved his chair back, towering over the table, his face flushed, red veins bulging at his temples. "This is garbage. You think a pile of papers will make anyone believe you?" He reached for the documents, ready to sweep them to the floor. I slammed my hand down first, wincing as pain shot through my healing ribs. "Touch them, and you'll add obstruction to your list of crimes." His eyes widened, fury sparking. For a split second, I thought he might strike me again. His hand twitched, balled into a fist. My heart pounded, but I didn't flinch this time. "You can't hit the truth out of paper," I said, my voice cold. The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Grandma rose, leaning heavily on her cane, her friends at her side. She placed a set of legal documents on top of the evidence. "Restitution papers," she announced, "prepared by Attorney Harvey Green. You sign tonight in front of witnesses or the police receive everything." My father's bravado faltered. His gaze darted to the women from church, to cousins staring wide-eyed to the damning stacks of proof under the glow of the chandelier. For once, the room wasn't his to command. "This is family business," he spat, turning to my mother. "Tell her. Tell them all. Family first." But my mother's lips quivered, her eyes wet. She looked at me at the bruises still faint on my face, and for the first time, she didn't speak. Silence was her only answer. David leaned forward, sneering. "Even if this is real, what do you think you'll get? You'll drag us all down, and for what? A few dollars?" $471,263, I shot back. "Not a few. My future. My life. Everything you stole because I wasn't a son." Gasps rippled through the relatives. Numbers were harder to argue with than accusations. Grandma slammed her cane again. "Enough Richard signed the papers. David signed too. Or I swear on everything holy this family will face courtrooms instead of Christmases." The tension stretched seconds, feeling like hours. Finally, my father snatched the pen, his grip so tight it nearly snapped. He scrawled his name on the restitution agreement, each letter jagged with rage. He shoved the pen toward David, who hesitated, his smirk faltering. Under the gaze of half the family and 3 church elders, he finally bent and signed. When it was done, Grandma gathered the papers back into the envelope with trembling hands. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "It's over." But my father couldn't leave it there. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You'll regret this, Emily. You destroyed this family." I met his glare without fear. "I didn't destroy it. I just stopped being your victim." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. One by one, relatives pushed back their chairs, murmuring excuses, slipping away from the poisoned table. When the last cousin left, only the core of us remained. My mother sat frozen, tears streaking her cheeks. My father stared at the wall, breathing hard, his empire crumbling around him. David poured himself another glass of wine with shaking hands, but even he couldn't meet my eyes. Grandma rested her hand on mine. You've done what I couldn't. You ended it. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Not safe yet, not whole, but lighter. The truth was out, written in ink they could no longer erase. The days after Christmas unfolded like an avalanche, slow at first, and then unstoppable. The restitution papers had barely dried when Harvey filed them with the county clerk. There was no undoing what had been signed in front of witnesses. My father could rage all he wanted, but the ink bound him. By mid-January, the first letters arrived. Notices from the bank demanding repayment on the fraudulent loans. Notices from the IRS requesting clarification on years of mismatched tax filings. For years, my father had operated in the shadows, forging signatures, laundering trust money quietly through joint accounts. Now the spotlight was on him, and every discrepancy glowed like neon. Neighbors began to whisper. The Carter family, once pillars of the community, were now fodder for gossip at church potlucks and grocery store aisles. Did you hear about Richard signed away $500,000 in restitution to his own daughter? Imagine stealing from your child. The shame once buried under Family First was now laid bare. The house itself bore the brunt of consequences. A foreclosure notice was nailed to the front door by February. I drove by one morning not to gloat, but to see it with my own eyes. The grand white columns, the carefully trimmed hedges, the wreath still hanging limp on the door, none of it could hide the bright orange paper flapping in the wind. A neighbor across the street shook her head. "Never thought I'd see the day," she muttered. David's fall was quieter but no less sharp. The bank where he worked discovered his role in siphoning tuition funds through fraudulent withdrawals. He was put on leave, then dismissed quietly to avoid scandal. His smirk, the one I had endured my whole life, disappeared the day he realized his credit cards were frozen and his apartment lease in jeopardy. He called me once, voice trembling with anger and desperation. "You've ruined everything, Emily. Everything." I listened in silence before hanging up. My mother clung hardest to denial. She continued to attend church, pearls around her neck, smile plastered on her face. But the whispers followed her too. Women she once gossiped with now crossed the pews to avoid her. She left services early, eyes downcast, her mantra of family, first sounding hollower with every passing week. And my father, Richard Carter, the man who once boomed with laughter at the head of the Thanksgiving table, shrank. I heard through neighbors that he barely left the house, sitting in the den with a glass of bourbon, staring at the restitution notice pinned to the mantel. The man who believed fists could silence the world was finally confronted with something he could not hid away: the law, the numbers, the truth. For me, life shifted in quieter ways. Debt collectors stopped calling once Harvey sent proof of identity theft. My wages were no longer garnished for fraudulent taxes. Slowly, the shadow of financial ruin lifted. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, breathing freely for the first time in years as I crossed off the last of the debts that had haunted me. Justice had come not as a single explosion, but as a steady cascade. Restitution payments began trickling in, seized from my father's accounts. They would never erase the bruises, never return the stolen years, but each dollar felt like a piece of power restored. I kept the documents locked in a fireproof box in my closet. Not because I needed them anymore. The courts had copies, Harvey had backups, but because they reminded me of the night I finally stood up. The night silence broke. Justice had its cost. My family, as I had known it, was gone, fractured beyond repair. But as I sat in my small apartment sipping tea, I realized something: the cost of silence had been far higher, and I was done paying it. By spring, the snow had melted from the streets of Columbus, and with it the weight that had pressed down on my chest for nearly 3 decades. My ribs had healed, though sometimes when I stretched too quickly, a dull ache reminded me of Thanksgiving night. But instead of anger, the ache carried a different meaning now, a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. The restitution payments arrived slowly, piece by piece, but Harvey made sure every cent was accounted for. Each time a check cleared, I set it aside, not for indulgence, but for liberation. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans, $30,000 that had haunted me since graduation. Clicking submit payment on that final installment felt like cutting a chain I had dragged for years. The next step was harder, but even more important. I enrolled in a part-time MBA program in Boston. It was something I had dreamed of for years, but never thought possible under the weight of debt and family sabotage. Now, with restitution funding the tuition, I filled out the application, pressed send, and within weeks received the acceptance letter. Holding that envelope, I cried not out of fear or loss, but out of joy so sharp it startled me. Moving to Boston was like stepping into a new skin. I rented a modest apartment near the Charles River, its walls bare at first, but quickly filled with small signs of freedom. A bookshelf stacked with textbooks I had chosen, a kitchen table bought with my own money, not inherited or borrowed. Each item was mine, untainted by theft or lies. Boundaries became my new religion. I changed my phone number, blocked David's calls, and told my mother through a curt email that contact would only be possible if she acknowledged what had happened. Her reply never came. My father predictably never reached out at all. Silence became their weapon again, but this time it did not cut me. It protected me. Grandma, however, became my anchor. True to her word, she moved to a small assisted living complex outside Boston to be near me. Every Sunday I picked her up for dinner and we sat together over bowls of clam chowder or roast chicken, laughing about nothing and everything. She told me stories about her youth, about the battles she had lost and the ones she had survived. "You've done what I always wanted to," she said one evening, her wrinkled hand resting on mine. "You drew the line. You said no more." My classmates in the MBA program became another kind of family. They didn't know the whole story, but they saw the drive in me. "You're relentless," one of them said after a group project. They didn't know the years of bruises, the forged documents, the weight of being the daughter who didn't count. But maybe they didn't need to. They only needed to see the woman who stood before them, sharp, determined, unbroken. There were moments of loneliness, of course. Nights when the city felt too big, when the echo of family first still rattled in my ears. But then I would remind myself that phrase no longer belonged to me. My family had wielded it as a chain. I had broken it. My family now was Grandma, a handful of friends who chose me and the self I was finally learning to love. Sometimes, walking home from class, I thought of my father sitting in that foreclosed house, my brother scrambling for a new job, my mother clutching her pearls at church. Once that thought would have filled me with bitterness. Now it only confirmed the truth: justice had been served. Boundaries had been drawn, and I was free. 1 year later, Christmas looked nothing like the holiday I had once known. Gone were the towering dining tables where my father sat like a king, gone the hollow laughter of relatives who looked the other way. This time, the table was small, just 6 chairs in my Boston apartment, a tree no taller than me, twinkling in the corner, and the scent of cinnamon rolls instead of roasted ham filling the air. Grandma sat at the head, her cheeks rosy, her cane propped against the wall. Beside her were her friends Martha and Ruth, who had stood as witnesses the night everything changed. 2 of my classmates from the MBA program joined us, bringing homemade dishes and stories of finals week. We clinked glasses filled not with wine, but with hot cider steam curling into the air. The laughter was softer, but it was real. As we passed plates around, Grandma looked at me with a smile that reached her tired eyes. "This feels more like family than anything I've had in years," she said. I raised my glass, feeling the warmth of the room sink deep into my bones. That's because it is family. Not the one we're born into, but the one we choose. For a moment, I thought of the old house in Columbus, likely dark and silent, now foreclosure signs still nailed to its door. I pictured my father staring at empty walls, my brother scrambling to rebuild, my mother clinging to denial. Once those images would have haunted me. Now they felt distant, almost like shadows from a story I had outgrown. The scars were still there, both on my body and in my memory, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders, marks that proved survival, not defeat. I was not the weak daughter cast aside. I was the woman who had stood, who had demanded justice, who had chosen freedom. After dinner, we gathered by the tree. Grandma insisted on handing out the small gifts I had wrapped in brown paper and twine. They weren't expensive scarves, journals, simple tokens, but the joy on each face as they unwrapped them filled me with more pride than anything money could buy. When the room quieted, Grandma raised her voice. "A year ago, I watched Emily fall to the floor, and I feared I'd lose her. Tonight, I see her stronger than ever. I thank God she stood up, and I thank God she's free." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but this time they were not from pain. They were from gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for justice, for the strange and beautiful truth that sometimes family is not blood, but choice. I leaned back, the lights from the tree reflecting in the window, and let the peace of the moment wash over me. Christmas, once a season of dread, had become a season of renewal. And as I looked around the table at the people who had chosen to stand with me, I felt certain of one thing: I had lost nothing worth keeping. What I had gained was everything. I smiled at my guests, lifting my glass one final time. To chosen family, to justice, and to never being silent again. The room echoed with agreement, and for the first time in my life, the words family first finally meant something true.